The Queen's death this year was a momentous event. Author Joanna Williams recently wrote a Spiked magazine article where she argued that the Queen's passing marked a cultural shift away from duty and towards victimhood, a victimhood personified in the elite worldview of Harry and Meghan, which she argues despise our traditions. But is this a fair assessment? Are we really moving away from a culture of duty and stoicism towards a new one of victimhood and identitarianism? Now, joining me is social commentator Dr. Rakib Ehsan. Thanks so much for joining me tonight. I want to ask you first of all about this idea of whether the death of the Queen has really marked a new era, a kind of shift in ethos when it comes to these ideas of duty.
Well, Andrew, I think when it came to the passing of the late Queen, there would have been many Brits who would have felt those values that she embodied, duty, responsibility, grace, restraint, and stoicism, they're increasingly dying out. That they're not in particularly high supply in modern day British society. I think that there is a degree of pessimism involved in that. I live in a community where I see those values every day, if truth be told, especially, interestingly, in traditional ethnic minority communities. So I think that it's very important that we do remain optimistic, but at the same time, we have to be wary of the fact that we have this modern anti-racism, which I feel is increasingly represented by a form of elite social activism, which is ultimately about peddling grievance-fueling narratives to boost one's own social status and financial position, as opposed to facilitating meaningful change in modern-day British society.
I mean, so much of the discourse of anti-racism, which once, of course, meant opposition to racism, and we could all get on board with that, but the phrase anti-racism is now about the detection of racist power structures that may be invisible to some people. And what happens, of course, is you end up with the situation, for instance, with Lady Hussey, where Ngozi Fulani detected racism, but racism may not have been there at all. Is this because being a victim in of itself now has a particular cultural clout?
Well, I think that there's that cultural clout dynamic there, as you say, Andrew. And I think some people see it as a way of heightening their own public profile. I felt that the whole Lady Susan Hussey and Ngozi Fulani affair was just an example of manufactured outrage. I've been asked on countless occasions where I'm from, and it's very easy for me to say that I was born in Hammersmith, I live in Luton, I'm of Bangladeshi and Indian origin. It only takes a few seconds. And I feel that actually, if you're quite open about your own identity, that can lead on to quite intellectually stimulating and interesting conversations between people that belong to different ethnic and religious groups. And I think in a way, when you have those conversations, of course, there may be misunderstandings along the way, but that actually helps build a more cohesive and resilient society in the long term.
Where do you think this has come from? I mean, I've had a number of experiences where I've seen people basically say to young people, you will always be oppressed. You know, some campaigners have said to young women, you will always be the victims of the patriarchy, or campaigners saying to young ethnic minority people, you will always be the victims of racism. Similarly with gay people. Where has this sort of thing come from? And is it not actually counterproductive to those young people and their mindset?
I think it's incredibly counterproductive, Andrew. I think that if people are truly, genuinely interested in young ethnic minority people, for example, progressing in their own country, you don't want to tell them incorrectly that our economic, social and cultural systems are deliberately rigged against them. And now, I'm not saying that there aren't improvements to be made in terms of improving equality of opportunity. Mind you, I think when it comes to those conversations, we need to talk more about class. To be honest, which has somewhat been lost on the modern left. But I do feel that for all of Britain's flaws, it is one of the most successful multiracial democracies in the world. And especially when it comes to the provision of anti-discrimination protections, especially on the grounds of race, ethnicity and religion, it outperforms many other multiracial democracies, especially those in Europe, such as France, Germany and the Netherlands.
Is the problem partly that victimhood appears to be rewarded if you can claim to be a victim? I mean, just to give an example, the way in which the LGBT acronym has now become LGBTQIA+, and effectively you've got straight people with a kink identifying into that community, into an oppressed class. Well, why else would they be doing that unless there come certain rewards of being the victim?
I think one interesting dynamic that I've come across on a number of occasions is that quite often it's privileged people doing that. So I think that they're quite insecure, interestingly, in their own position of economic privilege, and I think that they try to associate themselves with groups that may be seen as being oppressed in order to shake off that privilege. So I think that I think it's almost a middle class insecurity there, quite interestingly, which is quite responsible for much of the grievance politics that we're seeing in modern day Britain.
And do you think, I mean, we started this before you arrived by talking about Joanna Williams's article for Spiked about this sanctification of victimhood and this new culture. And she specifically focuses on the phenomenon of Meghan and Harry. And they might fit in very well to what you're describing here. These incredibly privileged people, well, actually, the most privileged people in the world, lecturing everyone else about privilege and claiming to be victims. And is it really, have they become sort of the poster people of this kind of mentality?
No, absolutely. I think that when I talk about modern anti-racist politics increasingly being about elite social activism, which involves individuals looking to heighten their own social status and quite possibly their own financial security, I think that the Sussexes embody that. If truth be told, I watched the docuseries all 6 episodes.
Oh, dear, I'm so sorry.
This thing is absolutely remarkable. For example, that the Commonwealth of Nations Voluntary Association was described as the British Empire 2.0. Yes. There was also the royal family. In my view, I think in some cases the royal family was unfairly vilified in the docu-series. And I think that a really important point that I'd make is that when you look at the late Queen, for example, she was a champion of interreligious dialogue, reaching out to non-Protestant Christian denominations as a Supreme Governor of the Church of England. And you have King Charles III referring to Britain as a community of communities, referring to himself as a defender of all faiths. I actually think that the royal family, through Queen Elizabeth II and King Charles III, they've done more for social cohesion in modern day Britain than some of these modern anti-racists ever could, Andrew.
Has Stoicism then died? I mean, you know, in that docu-series, which I fortunately haven't watched, but I've read enough about, I know that Harry and Meghan are exposing basically everything, and they're showing very intimate photographs continually, assuming that we have any interest in their love affair, which I personally don't. But they're doing all of that, and yet you've got the Queen, who kept her cancer diagnosis a secret until her death. I mean, it's just a world apart, just in terms of that stoic way of life. Is that something we can just consign to the past now?
Well, I think that people will deal with difficult experiences in their life in various ways. But I do feel that the one thing that I found particularly unsavoury with Harry and Meghan is exposing those family feuds and tensions in the most public way imaginable. For me, I'm quite traditional minded, but I think that there's many British people who may well feel that there are things that happen to them within their own family structures which are unsavoury, gone through difficult experiences, but they would rather keep that confined within the family and sort them out within their family units, as opposed to, how do you say, airing out their dirty laundry in the public.
Well, very interesting developments. Dr. Rakib Ehsan, thanks so much and Happy New Year.